Hi, I am Janet Davenport, and I am a book with Simsbury's Human Library. The title of my book is Pioneering Journalist. And the reason that that's the title of my book is because, indeed, I was a pioneering journalist in the 70s, the late 70s, 80s, and 90s, post-civil rights America, 20th century. I did not start out my journalism career to be a pioneer. I just wanted to be a journalist. But because of the times and because of the composition, the racial and ethnic composition of the newsroom, I found myself as a pioneer during that period, which meant that very often, I was the only, I teasingly call it the lonely only. I was the only Black woman. I often was the only African American at a time when not only people of color, but women were beginning to be hired in the newsroom to cover the news. Well, I often hesitate when people ask me about my formative years or how I grew up because for a very long time when people said, well, where are you from? Even as a teenager, I did not know how to answer that. I am the daughter of an Army officer, a military career, 22 years. My dad was in the Army, which meant that we traveled a lot. And just to give you a little flavor, I was born in Cleveland, Ohio. I began my early childhood at Fort Benning, Georgia. And from there, we went to Missouri, the Ozark Mountains at Fort Leonard Wood. And then we moved to Munich, Germany, which is where I began my early childhood education. I went to kindergarten and first grade in Munich. My baby brother was born in Munich. And then we returned to the United States. My parents, who were both Southerners, said, we're going home. And I remember as a child saying, well, I thought we were home. They said, no, this isn't our home. We are Americans. We're going back home. And when we came back to America, we started in New York City because we hadn't seen family for many, many years. And some of them had not even seen the babies who had been born while we were traveling. And from there, we went to visit family in Augusta, Georgia. And I remember it vividly because it was just such a range of different people. It was a lot of Black people. It's like, this is your family. And we went to Georgia, and I was out of school for so long that my parents put me in a first grade school, and it was a segregated school. And I remember saying to my Mom, there's only one white girl in the whole school. And my mother said, well, that's quite impossible because there are no white children who go to this school. So I was very confused. Then from there, we moved so now it's 1960, early 1960, 1961. We moved and settled, I thought, in Sudbury, Massachusetts. And I think there may have been only one other African-American family in town. And I'm told I was the first African-American child to go to the elementary school there. They even contacted my mother, my parents, because they wanted to make sure that my transition was as smooth as possible, because I later learned historically this was right around the time that Ruby Bridges and the children who were desegregating the schools down south were having a very different kind of experience. And the moving didn't stop. From there, we moved on base, or Army post, at Fort Devens, where my dad retired. From there, it was New Jersey. We thought we were going to settle there. And then finally, at last, when I was about 11, 12 years old, we settled in Springfield, Massachusetts, which is where I went to middle school and high school. And I consider Springfield my home because that is where I came of age. And so my story, I wish I could tell it more succinctly, but it's just not. It wasn't a straight line. There's so many people I've met in life. I was always so envious of them that they were born and raised in the same town. They were born and raised in the town of their aunties, their uncles, and their grandparents. And that was not my destiny, and that's not my story. So I come from a very diverse, my formative years were very diverse because during those travels I had many different kinds of friends because the military desegregated before the rest of the country. I believe it was President Eisenhower desegregated the military. So when we lived on army posts and in military communities, it was nothing to have friends who had Asian backgrounds. We had Jewish neighbors. I had neighbors. I grew up with Irish people, Italian people, Filipino people, Latino. And so multiculturalism was very much a part of my experience and my perspective. So by the time I was 12 years old, I felt I had traveled more than the average adult, and I had been introduced to more cultures than the average adult. And certainly my peers, so that kind of made me a little more of an other. My first role models were my parents. And as I have matured in life, I've come to appreciate them so much as I age and I look back on what they were going through in terms of as integrationists. So by the same token that I was the first or I was the only lonely, my father had received a direct commission as an officer in the right after World War II, which was unusual. So my parents were socializing with people from the Deep South who wanted nothing to do with African Americans or Black people. My father was a commander. He was an officer. He was commanding men who were from the South as well as from the North. So my first heroes and sheroes were my parents in terms of how they navigated, especially both of them. They were both from Georgia. They were both products of the Great Depression and this Jim Crow South. They were both descendants of enslaved people. And I get goosebumps when I think about it. And I grew up in a home, now my parents were not particularly highly educated. My dad did go to some college after he had received a commission as an officer, but they were very well read and very erudite people, it's because of the way they were educated. My father went to a historically Black high school that was founded by a woman named Lucy Laney. Lucy Laney was the mentor of Mary McLeod Bethune. My father studied Greek, Latin, trigonometry. He was a brilliant, just a smart man. My mom was smart. They were what we would back in the day called street smart, as well as they had human intelligence. They understood people. And so my dad made sure as we were traveling, we knew our family stories. That's why it's so important for families. I don't care whether you're African American, Latino, Irish American, whether you're Catholic, Protestant, Jewish. It's good to know your stories. It's good to know where you came from. And my parents made sure we knew where we came from. And they said it's important to know where you came from so you could appreciate what you have, and it helps you to know where you're going. I know an awful lot because my parents were prolific. My whole family, they're Southern storytellers or oral. They are from the oral tradition. My mother could sit and tell a story and give you names and dates and ages with such a remarkable detail. I could never do that. I think that's why I became a writer, because it's like, I've got to write this down. I'll never remember all of this. And my father, they were big on, I think it was just in their DNA, And they were just simply telling the stories of their lives, and they were very open. And my father, when he would tell us the stories of how they were treated growing up in the South, my mother would become more emotional. My father was a pragmatist. And he said, you have to understand the context of the times. And my father told stories of, I'm trying to think of a succinct way of putting this. Without going into too much detail, his father was a domestic worker for a very wealthy and prominent political white family in the South. And this family, there's a story that I can't go into detail about it now, but the relationship, it's a peculiar relationship because there is this whole notion of place, and that Black people had their place. But even within that context, Blacks and whites in the South, in the Jim Crow South, did have friendships. They did have affection that people don't like to talk about. When I say affection, sure, there was brutality, there was abuse and those kinds of things, but I think what I'm trying to say is that my father, he told a story of certain kindness or certain things that this white family, that his family was in close relationship with, did. And I quote him, he said, as a boy, he began to see that not all white people were bad. And my mother, on the other hand, God rest her soul, she was a little more militant, but she was a humanitarian. And so she said it really is about what's in a person's heart. And so they taught us to treat people as individuals, that there are good and bad in every group of people, and you have to get to know a person to get to know their heart. And as corny as it sounded to me as a kid, they were absolutely right. They said, never judge a group of people, which was what was done to Black people. You cannot paint a whole race of people with the same brush. I did. I had the opportunity, but back in those days, silly me, I was the first in my family to go to college. I was the first, not in my extended family. I had cousins. In fact, it's interesting. My southern cousins had one of my father's sisters was a teacher. So I come from a family of teachers and preachers and educators, and they had gone on to, teachers' colleges and that sort of thing. But we were the Northerners, and I was the first to go to college, and I didn't know what I wanted to do. And it sounds kind of silly saying this. I should have majored in English and literature, but I didn't because I wanted to stretch myself. So, of all things, I applied to Boston University, and I got into their School of Nursing. So I started out as kind of more of a science major. And when I got to college, it got to university and discovered, wow, there's so many things I can study. And my dad said to me, I'm really surprised, Janet, that you didn't become an English major. So I went through a period as an undergrad where, I had some personal issues and then some relationship issues, and long story short, things got a little complicated, and so I dropped out of school. Like I said, this is a very expensive place to not know what you want to be when you grow up. But the truth of the matter is I did not know what I wanted to be, but I did know what I wanted to be. You know what? I did know what I wanted to be, but it seemed so far-fetched at the time. I wanted to be a writer, but what did that mean? I just wanted to write. I wanted to tell people stories. And I should say here, as a child, I dreamt of being a writer because I loved stories. I loved to read. And an important thing I kind of left out, and I know I'm jumping around, is, and I loved people's stories, to know where people came from, what shaped them. I was an observer, but as a 17, 18-year-old, I hadn't quite put it together in a career. And during this time that I went away to college, there were no role models. There were role models in terms of character, drive, taking care of your family, going to college, but there were no, I didn't even think about journalism. I didn't even think about journalism as a viable path. I don't remember seeing newscasters. I don't remember seeing anything written in the paper about by Black people. It didn't seem possible. But when I got to Boston, my horizons broadened, and I began to discover more possibilities. And I wanted to be a writer. But even then, it wasn't a straight line. It was more of a spiral. I did drop out of school and then disillusioned. And at the time, I moved back home to Springfield. I was trying to make a decision about whether or not to move out to the Midwest with my partner at the time. You know, I'm going to tell you the truth. There's always a man behind every woman's story, every smart woman's story. There's always a man. There's always a romance, and I had married young, and so I separated from my husband to try to figure out what it was I wanted to do. And I shared this. One of the stories I shared as a book with one of my readers. I'd like to share it now. It's okay. The way I got my first journalism job, because I knew I wanted to write for, and I think my job objective, a reputable publication. Well, that would be hard to define right now, but back in the late 70s, so we're talking maybe 78, 79, I'm staying at my parents'. I said, well, I'm not sure what I'm going to do. I need a job. I started, my parents I'm trying to think how many miles they lived from downtown. I actually started walking. I didn't have a car. And I saw a friend and I I bummed a ride downtown. And I said to my friend, drop me off right there. It was the newspaper. It was a big building on Main Street. I said, I'm going to go in there and ask for a job. I'm going to go there and see if they have any job openings. Because those were the days you filled out job applications and you actually went inside buildings and interfaced with people. And I went in there, and I remember what I wore, because I'm a writer, these details. I had on my skinny jeans, I had on a sweatshirt, and my hair was cropped, very short, little short afro. And I went in and I said to the receptionist, I'd like to speak to the editor. And she said, oh, okay, hold on. And she said, hello, Mr. Garvey. And his name was Richard Garvey. And I'm going to say his name because the late Richard Garvey, Google him. He was a legend in Massachusetts at the time, encyclopedic mind. He was the editor of the paper. And he said, send her right up. And I walked up the steps and I walked into the newsroom, and that they were typing on their typewriters. I saw a few women, but most all men. It was just this. It was the bullpen, and this like you've seen on TV or read about in books. And it was all white guys, a lot of old white guys, some younger white guys. So I'm aware of that. So I went and sat outside Mr. Garvey's office and had a nice chat with Mr. Garvey. And I was so enthusiastic. I look back on it, I think it was my enthusiasm. And then the question he asked me was, so did you go to school in Springfield, the high school? And I said, yes. And I told him my English teacher, I had taken this advanced composition course. He said, oh, if you had her, I know you can string words together. So I got a job as a stringer, making 25 cents a word. And I remember, and I worked with, he assigned me to work with the city editor at the time. Now, mind you, as I tell you, I was a college dropout. My city editor, he was not a college graduate. A lot of the people in the newsroom were not college graduates. You want to talk about merit? Those were those stories you hear about working your way up. There was still that in a bit in the atmosphere. So I was really taken on as an apprentice. A lot of journalists back in the old days, because journalism is considered a trade. That's a trade. It's a part of the intellectual industry, but it's a craft, it's a trade. And a lot of newspaper men became newspaper men, working their way up as gophers. And, but then, they start having educational requirements. And I did that for maybe 6 months, 7, 8, 9 months, and then I left and I went back to college. I went back to school, but not for journalism. I did take some journalism courses, but I went back to school and I got a degree in social work. I could not find, I had a nice portfolio because I did some really nice pieces as a stringer, and they even gave me an opportunity to do some feature stories. At that time now, the newspapers were different than they are that's when you had a real evening. I worked for the evening paper, which meant that, that was the paper that got thrown at the end of the day. And then there was a morning paper, but I worked for the evening paper. And I had done some human interest stories that were news feature stories. I had done some stories covering community meetings. I had done some spotlight type stories to really hone and sharpen my reporting and writing skills. And I had a nice little portfolio. And in fact, my editor at the time said, now when you go out to the Midwest, and I went to Wisconsin, he said, you've got a better portfolio than a lot of reporters. And he said, you should have no problem getting a job. But that's another chapter, because in that chapter, I moved out to, I didn't move out to I didn't move to Madison or Milwaukee. I moved to Appleton. And Appleton, Wisconsin. And I say this without exaggeration, I lived there for about a good year and a half before I ever saw another black person. I went out my door one day to the mailbox, and people almost got in accidents turning around because it's like, I can't believe I just saw a black woman. It was
78, 79?
It was a culture shock. There were many our neighbors had never met a black person before, they would say. Those are the kinds of things people would say. And I lived in Appleton, but then we also lived in Oshkosh, which was a college town, so there was more diversity there. And then ended up in Green Bay. And there was the biggest diversity in Green Bay was the football players, because they thought every black man was, do you play for the Green Bay Packers? It was like, no. But anyway, I digress. I did not get a job, and I actually went to a paper. I'm trying to remember, it's the Appleton paper. And they were not interested in me as a reporter, but they were interested in doing a story on my family. Because those were the days of yuppies, upwardly mobile. Remember the yuppies? Well, we were the buppies, the black, upwardly mobile black family. And they were interested in doing the story of what it's like for a black family to live in this community. And I was not interested in being the news. I wanted to report the news. And then I went to another paper. And I can't believe, when I look back on it, sometimes when you think about what people have said to you, it's really pretty astonishing. and I look back on it, I was that type of kid. I was the type of kid, I would just go in and ask, do you have any jobs? And I usually always had pretty good success in getting jobs like that. But the editor or the man I spoke to at the time said, look, he said, we have our quota. He said, we don't, he, you know what he said to me? He said, we don't need another pretty face around here. And he pointed over to this reporter, and it was kind of well known at the time because of his byline. He was Panamanian, he was from Panama, a man of color. He was a dark man. And he said, we have our quota. And I didn't know how to process that because I didn't know what he was talking. See, so there's, what do they say? Youth is wasted on the young. I look back on it. I was so enthusiastic and gung-ho. And it's not that I was politically naive. I knew about the controversies with affirmative action and all that stuff, but I didn't wake up every morning saying to myself, "Oh, I'm an affirmative action person. I'm a DEI." That's not how I was raised. That's not how I thought of myself. And then if people said things like that to me, I didn't know how to process it. Then I said, "Oh, you know what he said to me?" So that gave me a window into, it wasn't a mirror, it was a window. It wasn't a mirror. I said, this isn't about me. This is about you and how you view me or people who look like me. And then those have become, and we didn't have language for it then. Those were microaggressions, full frontal attacks, insults right to your face, and barriers. Because, what do you mean you don't have a quota? What do you mean you have a quota? So it was a while. So I stayed out in the Midwest for about 7 years, and things didn't work out, and I came back home, and everywhere you go, it's always like this frontiers, So apparently, now this is the 80s, and more African Americans, and I say African Americans because we were we were at the forefront of civil rights. We were at the forefront of trying to ensure that there was equal opportunity and pushing for equal opportunity in employment, housing, all across the board. So employment, just want a job, just want to pursue my career. But in the 80s, when I returned, apparently even being a black social worker was a big deal. That, being a state social worker, being a social worker for the state was very political. It was about connections. And so now we're getting some college grad. Oh, we can't find, that was the saying back then, finding qualified blacks. Because see, that was the whole thing about affirmative action. Just to have blacks, you're hiring unqualified people. Sound familiar? You're hiring unqualified blacks just to have blacks. When in fact, and even though I've told you my story where mine was kind of, no, I didn't have a master's degree. I didn't go to J school, but I had the chops. I had the goods. I had the talents. I had the drive. I had the curiosity, the intellectual curiosity. All of the things that you want in a reporter. I had a nose for news. All of the things you want in a reporter. But I came back, and as a social worker, I also went into social work because I do care. I care about society. I cared about people. I was an idealist. I wanted to be a change maker. I wanted to have a positive effect on people's lives. But I found working for the state as a social worker was, I was working against the system. I had to fight the system to help the people. But the way I got that job was kind of fortuitous, though, too, because apparently in Springfield, they were looking for more social workers of color, but having a hard time. But now, instead of just your resume, they wanted your transcript. And so what we said among ourselves was, as soon as we start learning how to play the game, they change the rules. So now it's like, not only do we want to see that you have a college degree or that you have a degree in social work, we want to see what your grades were. So the affirmative action officer who I had spoken with, he saw my resume. He said, "Well, wait till I show them this." It was kind of funny. And he called me the whiz kid from Wisconsin. Because I had almost a 4.0. So there was not going to be any question about it, because that's what would happen is, well, and apparently my reputation preceded me, because when I went into the department, it was like, oh, there's the whiz kid from Wisconsin. That's kind of hard to live up to, right? But to me, again, that was a window, not a mirror. I said, oh my goodness, it's exhausting. I said, this is exhausting. So I burnt out quick, and I called my mentor at the University of Wisconsin. I've lost touch with her, but it was a woman, Professor Wurtzmott, Dr. Wurtzmott. And I said, I can't do this. I said, I can't do this. She said, the ones who care, you really care about people. I'm not surprised. So I said, I'm going to pursue my writing. And she'd always encouraged my writing. In fact, she had published, check this out, when I was a student, I wrote an essay for one of her textbooks. So, I had published in her textbook. I had done some freelancing stuff, right? So I called the Springfield newspaper, and I asked to speak to the guy that I remembered was the city editor. And they said, well, no, he's not the city editor anymore. He's been promoted. He's the managing editor. So I said, hello, do you remember me? He said, yeah, you're the black chick with the short afro and the jeans. I said, yeah. He said, well, you know what? There is an opening for full-time reporter. Why don't you apply for it? He said, but you have to take a test. And of course, the rest is history, vocabulary, and then you had to write sample. They'd raise the bar, and no problem, no problem. As my dad used to say, I don't want a free pass onto. I don't know why he used this analogy. My father always used to say, what they don't understand is we don't want a free pass to the ice skating rink. I just want to get on the ice and compete. My father was very competitive. I never saw myself as competitive with other people. I was competitive with myself. And I was fortunate and blessed to have editors who used to say, that's the attitude to have, because you want to be better than, you want to do well, and then you want to do better. So you always want to outdo yourself. So I got hired as a reporter, and again, now we've moved from typewriters to computers, but they're the mainframes, and you got the word processors. And first day on the job, I get there again. Well, there's more women now, but there's nobody who looks like me. And I'm like, wow. And I think this was 1984. I'm like, what in the world? And now when I look back on it, we weren't that. So that's 20 years after this, the Civil Rights Act and all that legislation. That's 20 years after Brown versus the Board of Education making, segregation illegal, and we're still living in a very segregated society. And as a Black person going into jobs that no one has held before, you realize how segregated the workplace is. You realize how limited opportunities are, because you're not the only whiz kid from Wisconsin. You're not the only smart one. You're not the only qualified person. And by this time, I had minored in communications. My experiences as a social worker and with people only enriched the perspective I brought to journalism. And so I was a general assignment reporter, which meant I covered a little bit of everything. Courts, police. I would cover certain towns, cover regional boards. I would do public health stories that actually I'm proud and glad to say that my writing did make a difference, impacting certain issues of concern, covered politics, and race. Back in those days, we had race beats. But I didn't cover the Black community. There became a need to cover the Latino community. And after talking to some of my Latino associates and friends, and one colleague in particular, I got their blessing, because they said, you bring a perspective, but you're not, but you're still objective, Because sometimes I found that as a reporter and as a curious person, the less you know, the more you want to know. So you don't become so familiar. So I actually covered Latino affairs for a number of years, including my big thing was going to Puerto Rico. Hurricane Hugo. Post Hurricane Hugo, I went to Puerto Rico and covered the cleanup there, and also because the community in Western Mass, the people from the Puerto Rican community really wanted to know what was happening to their loved ones. And it was amazing. And this was before high tech. We still didn't have the high tech that we do now. So that was a wonderful experience. So at heart, I'm an essayist, and I do have a perspective, and I'm informed, and I have opinions. And there had only been one other woman on the editorial board at the Springfield paper at that time, a white woman. And remember, the context of all this is, too, part of what's going on now with people of color, African Americans, and women is, you have to do it like a man. Do you have to, in order to be successful, do you have to do it like a man? Do you have to be a journalist like a man? Do you have to do it? It's like, do you have to do it like a white person? Well, what does that mean, right? What does it mean? Can't you just be yourself? So, but there was a colleague of mine, and we're still friends to this day. And she was a master reporter. She was excellent, just excellent. And she and I said, "Wow, I think I'd like to try writing for the editorial page." And she said, "I would too." And then she said, "Oh, well, we probably couldn't do it. Yeah, we probably wouldn't get hired." Then we both, it's like this light bulb. We said, "Do we hear ourselves? Do you hear yourself?" Because we were friends, we were girls. We cared about women's issues. We talked about, we were desk mates. So I said, "I'll apply if you apply." She said, "Okay, I'll apply." I said, "I'm going to apply." So I applied so that's the other thing too. Things are not just given to you. Things were never just given to me. I asked, I applied, I tried. So, and I see that so clearly now as a young person. I said, because I was only in my 30s at this point, mid to late 30s, and I went in and I spoke to the editor, the executive editor, went right into his office and said, I'm interested in what is involved. He said, I was thinking about you as an editorial page editor. He said, but I didn't think you'd be interested. So we talked about it. And I met with the publisher. And you have to be realistic about these kinds of things in terms of what being the first. So this means you're going to be the first African American and the first African American woman to be an editorial page editor if you get the job. And that has political implications. Political, not politics with a small p, but editorial pages do political endorsements. They editorialize sensitive political issues, including race. And so they were as much behind closed doors interested in how I look back on it. I didn't see myself as young. I felt very mature. But how is this young? Because the editorial page editors, they were in their 60s, mid 50s, early 60s. That was the place the good journalists went before retirement. So they were much older. So it's like, how's this young Black woman going to handle these kinds of situations? So I did get the job, and it had its moments. I'll put it that way. Yes, because I was an editorial page editor in Springfield, and then I was on the editorial board at the Hartford Courant. So those were two, in both of those positions, they had challenges, similar challenges, and different challenges, because at the Springfield newspaper, I was, and another woman then was hired, a white woman, and we became friends, was also hired as an editorial page editor. So part of the challenges were, you could tell there were assumptions about the girls. It was assumed, for example, she and I would be discussing an issue that we were going to editorialize, and we were kind of doing an analysis of a social issue or an event in the news. And the guys would treat us like we were chatting about daycare, which would have been fine, but we're chatting on the job. Men discuss important issues, women chat. We were treated like chatty Cathys. We had administrative support for the editorial page editors. If the guys, because the editorial board at Springfield was small, it was the executive editor, the publisher, these two senior white guys, and then myself and my other female colleague. If we asked for administrative support, we wouldn't get it. We would get a hard time, even from the female clerks. If I expected something to be done in the production room, because we were in charge, this is kind of inside baseball, but in order to put those pages out back in those days, we were putting those, you're writing the editorial, you're researching, you're writing the editorial, you're talking to people, and we were responsible for the production of those pages, which was another thing I had going, as I was not afraid of technology, and I could do pagination and layout. And I heard that one specific incident was, they didn't know at the time when my daughter had a little internship in the production room back there, and they didn't know she was my daughter. And she said to me, "Mom, every time you come back to the production room to check on something, they say, here comes that BITCH again." And the first time I heard that they were calling me a BI, because I had because had expectations. Is this ready? Is this done? Can you fix this? I lamented that to my white female colleague who was old. She was older than I was, and she had more editing experience. She said sarcastically, "You have arrived." In other words, you're doing your job. That's what. In other words, you've heard those stories. When a woman is doing her job, she's a bitch. When a man's doing his job, he's the man. In terms of color, one of the biggest challenges was the ignorance within the newsroom itself. Among my, when I say ignorance, not that they were intellectually ignorant, but so woefully, culturally, and historically deficient. So that a lot of my time was spent educating. And I know that sounds kind of pompous as I'm saying it now, but I'm just glad to be able to have the opportunity to tell the truth. Because I feel like that's the truth that doesn't get told. I'll never forget one day I was standing in the newsroom and I said, you know what? The hard part about this job is making people here, my colleagues, aware that they're not correct about certain things. So, for example, in the community, if a white child or white girl would go missing, there's headlines. If a black child or black girl would go missing, where's the story? And so if you brought that up, oh, you have a chip on your shoulder. Why is everything about race? Because if you're at the table discussing things and making decisions, and you bring up a perspective or bring up about black people, always about race. And I said, people are so prickly. They were so prickly. Now remember, I grew up in a home that was comfortable talking about race. I had many different kinds of friends. And sometimes I would just want to bring up a cultural notion or idea. You would think I'd thrown a Molotov cocktail in the room or something. That's where the pioneering I was fighting so much for, and there are editorial standards, and sometimes there were double standards. So, for example, in the Massachusetts, in the Western Mass paper, there had been a decision that neighborhoods would be identified in the paper specifically by a neighborhood. So, for example, if you have I'm going to use Connecticut as an example. So I'm sure there's neighborhood, Terrifville, right? Is that a neighborhood, right? The way that it was used in identifying a community, in the white community in the paper, they would say, in the Terrifville neighborhood last night. But when they did it in the black community, it would be in the Mason Square. They would lump they were all distinct neighborhoods, but they would lump them all together because everybody knew that was the black section of the town. It's just like in a city, you have the Italian section, you have the black section, you have the Irish section. And so they would be, and I brought that to an editor's attention. And the other thing too, back in those days, I was, everybody in the newsroom had a potty mouth. That was the other thing too, that was intimidating for the girls. And for me, as a black woman, I wasn't accustomed to being the F-bomb. And he used the F-bomb. I was bringing it to an editor's attention that I thought the policy was that you're going to specify, tease out the neighborhood. And he said something to the effect of, oh, it's all the same. It's a stone throw away. It's all the same. And he used the F-bomb, and I used the F-bomb back. And then my friends and I, because we had a little crew, white and black, was being and we went to lunch, and I said, and the whole time at lunch, I said, I think I just lost my job. But I felt very passionately about that, and I came back, and he had sent out an edict to all of the editors to stop lumping. It was worded much more officially, to stop doing that, and that, you know, this neighborhood is this neighborhood, this neighborhood is, and stop. In other words, so what people never saw back in those days, and even into the early 21st century, the mistakes and the damage and the trauma that didn't make it into the paper because somebody was fighting, and it was a war of words. It was an intellectual war to make certain things not happen. No, don't use that. Don't refer to people like that. Don't use that language. That minorities, for example, that was a big one. That's a government term, you know. I never wrote a story using that language. There's so many different ways to call. I remember someone saying, "Well, what do we call? What do we call?" I said, "Well, call them. Are they? How do they? What do they want to be called?" And these are the kind of editorial board discussions, you know. Why are they flying that flag all the time? Well, why don't you ask them? Do you know? And that's the point. The underlying point is that I was working with people who were not in relationship or conversation with people who did not look like them. But yet and still, they were covering the stories and the lives of these people who did not look like them. I'm gonna give you one more example. A court reporter came in one time. There was a murder. There's this trial, and maybe it wasn't a murder trial, but there was a trial going on. And I remember the court reporter coming in and being disgusted because the young black man that was being tried, I think he might have been 17 or 18, he wasn't even interested in his own case. He was on the bench outside the courtroom, sagging and sleeping. I said, well, what do you, all right. If you've spent the night locked up in jail what would you be doing the next day? Looking fresh as a rose? You know, those kinds of things. It was like, we've got to take it and remember to look at people as, and that's what always gets me too. I don't see color. That was the other thing. By the time I got to Hartford, those were the days that I don't see color. That was the colorblind. That was I call that chapter, it's colorblind. A well-meaning colleague said to me, in fact, he was my boss, and I have a lot of respect for him to this day. Wonderful, wonderful editorial page editor, and he meant well, and he said to me, Janet, when I see you, I don't see color. I said, well, then you don't see me. That's like saying, Janet, when I see you, I don't see a woman. That's like saying, Janet, and by the time I left the editorial board, so I didn't have an ulcer, but I did have irritable bowel. I was being treated for irritable bowel syndrome, which I have not had since, by the way. I was at the Hartford Courant for I think it was 6 years. 6 years, yeah, 6 of my almost 20 years. And that was an interesting editorial board because it was, as the editorial page editor, because by this time I was an editorial writer, so influencing the editorial decisions and opining local, national, and international issues, and half the board was, there were 12, that was back in the days when you had an editorial board of 12 people, not including the publisher, who automatically is a member of the editorial board, but there were 6 women and 6 men, and I was, of course, the second African-American woman to, and the only one at that time on the board. And during my tenure there, we did have, briefly, male journalists of color. We had a Latino fellow who wrote for a while, and then an African-American man who was there briefly. So that was very interesting because the boards, in fairness to the boards, they are very thoughtful. The deliberations, we met 3 times a week, and we would bring the issues of the day forward and present our views and opinions and how we wanted to write about it, and we'd have debates. And it's very interesting. It was a very interesting experience, but very often I was on the hot seat by virtue of my color. And so, I remember during board meetings we might have been talking about a social welfare issue. There was an assumption, not by all, but and invariably one member said, I bet you are pro-welfare. I said, well, what makes you think that? They were just like assumptions because I'm African American, and that's the other thing too. That's why it's important to know my story. No, I did not. There's nothing wrong if I'd grown up in the ghetto, whatever the ghetto is. But there were assumptions about me based on their stereotypical understanding of what Black life was. And I had anything but a typical life for a Black child or any kind of child, Yeah, there were just assumptions made about my views before I even had a chance to, or one of the dynamics that was particularly irritating, was I would say something and then there would be silence, and then a white guy would say the same thing. Oh yes, and then there would be a lively conversation about it. I just said that. That's what I just said. So there was always that, And then if there was an issue about Black people or Black this or Black that, Janet, I'm like, there are 30 million ways of being Black in America, and I'm just one of them. I cannot speak for all Black people, but based on my knowledge and experience, I can provide this particular insight. I can correct you. Your data is wrong, or you're misinformed, but I'm not here to represent the entire Black race. But I felt people were so prickly about race, somebody had to bring it up every now and then. So I became known for, and one of my white female colleagues teased me, she called me Rosa Parks. Because she had become, she called her, and she was Mother Teresa, because it's like somebody's got to bring up these, because you don't want to fit into the stereotypes, but if there are issues being neglected. So I pioneered the initial project on complicity at the Hartford Courant. It was broken on the editorial pages before it became, a few years later, it became this big thing that turned into a book and all of this stuff. It started on the editorial page because I wanted to bring to light information I had discovered in working with some middle school children in Hartford on slavery in Connecticut. And they had found in the ancient burial grounds that there were children, slaves, had been buried there, and that made me curious. And when I proposed it as a project, as an editorial project, you would have thought I had told them, I'm going to kill all of your family members. because people they were so uncomfortable. They did not want the story anything other than abolition shared. But lo and behold, one of the things I love about journalists, there's a certain spirit in journalists worth their salt. And even though they didn't fully support me, the editorial page editor, he said, if one person feels passionate about something, and then I found one of the newer editorial board members who happened to be Jewish. I could see the lights go off, and we did a project that really turned, and it won some national awards, the National Op-Ed Award. We did a series on slavery in Connecticut. There was a graphic showing Connecticut during that time, a map of Connecticut, downtown, not Connecticut, I'm so sorry, Hartford, downtown Hartford, and it's like every other address. Innkeeper, 3 slaves, ministers, 5 slaves, that type of thing. And it was done for educational purposes. But then, like I said, and we heard that many of the schools in Connecticut were using that project for education. So that's why it's so amazing to me now. That was back in the that was in the 90s, 96, 97. And here we are in 2025 and still struggling to tell these stories that are so important for everyone to know. Because the more we know these stories, the more we know each other and appreciate each other. And forgive I understand why there's hatred and bitterness, but ever since I was a kid, I just was like, all I said was, you just bring up, if I found out someone was from Switzerland, or because I have a friend, I'm interested in my genealogy. And it's because I'm interested in my genealogy, I'm interested in yours and how you got here. But there's something about slavery, and I still say that. And there's something about Black history that makes people go bananas. But I feel like my family, we talk about it as it's a matter of fact. My second great grandparents were enslaved people on both sides, They were enslaved. That's not going to go away. And then they were freed. And then there was struggle. That's not going to change. No matter, you can deny the opportunity to talk, but so it's like, let's talk about that, and we can learn from that. It's important to talk about it and to learn. And if you don't know how, that's okay. It's okay to say you don't know how. I just think it's important, though, for people from different backgrounds to have these conversations, to have authentic conversations. And I think that takes genuine interest. And I think when you have genuine interest, that reflects the interest you have in yourself and your family. What I have discovered is when I was young, I thought I was going to write the great American novel, and I traveled far and wide looking for the great stories. And we are the stories. We're the great stories. And we want to keep an atmosphere and an environment where we can share our stories, because I think the more we share our stories, and I say this sincerely, we really are, the human family is a family. And if you start with that as a concept, communication it's not only enriching, it can enrich your life and it can inform, but it can change you. And to me, it's cliched, the only constant in life is change.